formation of EFCC, there has been no serious conversation around the people, which is why I decided that I would attend this, because this is the first conversation I'm seeing that actually is not about politicians fighting each other. Now, the problem with all that noise is that it has all the consequences of noise. No matter what you're doing, if you create too much noise, nobody sees your good work. Nobody is seeing progress on security. Nobody sees progress on the fight against corruption. All we see is a constant struggle between certain politicians and others, holding this entire country to ransom. And all of us have been sucked into it. So let me join the Sultan by calling on our political leaders at the national and subnational level to please remember that elections are in 2019, not 2017. Nobody wins an election in 2017. It is not yet time. Let's talk about education and healthcare. We all understand when we get to late 2018, you stop working and politicize. We all understand that. But it is too early to leave your posts. You can't be in politics for 4 years. And this is a big problem. So we're talking about a difficult economic environment. A lot of that difficulty is self-inflicted. Now let's talk about policies. I've spoken a few times on the economy. I think I've actually said enough. There isn't much to add, but what I will do is I will summarize what my position has been in the last 2 years. If you look at Africa in the so-called Africa Rising Decade, and you look at African economies and their GDP and ask yourself, what has been the major driver of growth in Africa? And why has that suddenly changed? You'd find that Africa Rising was a story that was built on 2 pillars. The first pillar was rising commodity prices, occasioned partly by the rise of China, the strength of Chinese and Indian growth. The second was rising debt. Because what happened was, after the Paris Club and London Club negotiations, after the HIPC programs, African economies found themselves deleveraged, and then they quietly went on a borrowing binge, borrowing domestically to fund recurrent expenditure, and that fueled growth. And that was true of Nigeria, as was true of many other commodity producing African countries. Now, as a country, we need to understand that the growth of Nigeria in the periods of high growth was driven largely by rising commodity prices and debt. And that model has now reached the logical limits. The collapse in oil price has made that very obvious. Today, if you're looking at debt, if you take the IMF Article 4 consultation report, the federal government of Nigeria is spending 66% of its revenue on interest on debt. 66%. Which means only 34% of revenue is available for capital expenditure, for recurrent expenditure, and for development. That model cannot work. If you look at the 2017 budget of the federal government, and I don't know if people are looking at those headline numbers, and I sometimes wonder what Nigerian economists are doing. The 2017 budget presented by the federal government, the amount earmarked for debt service is in excess of the entire non-oil revenue of the federal government. But that's not the problem. The problem is that it is also a budget that also goes for even more debt. So if you're paying 66% of your revenue as interest and you add more debt, where do you stop? 70%, 80%, when do you stop? And the key to forums such as this is that as a country at the national level and as state governments at the sub-national level, we need to understand that the model of government borrowing and spending has reached its limit. Growth can only come from investment. Growth can only come from investment. It cannot come from consumption. It cannot come from the government balance sheet because government doesn't have money. It cannot come from borrowing because you cannot borrow unsustainably. And everybody from the federal government to the state and local government has to ask one question and one question only. How do I make Nigeria? How do I make my state? How do I make my local government, my emirate, the attractive destination for the scarce capital flying around the world? And I honestly do not think either at the national or at the, and I have the head of NIPC here, I stand to be corrected. I don't think that that mindset change has happened. And the way to see it is to look at the budget. If you're still borrowing money to finance infrastructure, then you're still in that mindset of borrow and spend. We have governors. They go to China, spend 1 month on a tour of China, and what do they come back with? MOUs for debt. China will lend you $1.8 billion to build light rail. You know, this light rail will be done by, the rail will come from China, the trains will come from China, the engines come from China, the labor comes from China, the driver is Chinese. At the end of the day, what do you benefit from it? Your citizens? You ride on a train. And when you ride on this train, if you're in northern Nigeria, if you're in a state like Kano or Kaduna, if you ride on a light rail train, where are you going to? You're not going to an industrial estate to work. You're not going to school. You're not going to the farm. You borrow money from China to invest in trains so that your citizens can ride on the train and go for weddings and naming ceremonies. Because that is all that is happening. There is no economy. Why do you want a train if you don't have an economy? And, you know, these are what we, because at the end of the day, a nation and a state is only transformed by vision. Once that vision is flawed, every single thing that follows from that logically collapses, which is why I like the idea of an investment company, because anyone who is interested in bringing in investors, anyone who's like we listened today saying, come and invest in Kaduna, has already made that mindset change and said, you know what, the growth of my economy is not going to come. It's not going to come from me borrowing money. Sorry, this is Chinese silk, so let's just look at. You've made the mindset that the growth of my state is not going to come from me going to burden my balance sheet with even more debt to build roads. Why do you want the government to build power plants? Why do you want the government to build rail lines? If these rail stations, if this light rail is profitable, make it possible for a private investor to come and build it. Now, I say this because in northern Nigeria in particular, the governments need to conserve their resources for those areas where government has failed in the last few decades. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in healthcare. We are in denial. The Northwest and the Northeast, demographically, constitute the bulk of Nigeria's population.